Thank you very much, and can I start by saying thank you for coming along, because whenever I get invited to speak somewhere, I think there must come a time when people will get sick of listening to me, and I'll turn up to an empty room and feel terrible. Now, Word Watching, my book of essays about language, is all about language, and the fact that language is the barrister's stock in trade is entirely accidental. I've always been fascinated by language, from about the age of 5 or 6, when as a child I discovered that using big words impressed grown-ups, and that meant treats. Unfortunately, for many people for whom language is central to their work, like lawyers, politicians, business people and so on, they can be a bit careless about the way they use language. Now, the point of language is to convey meaning, and ideally it should do so accurately. Not all writers and speakers honour that ideal. The results of that sometimes come about by carelessness, or by foolishness, or by malice. And depending on what the cause is, so the results will be found in one of 3 camps. In the first camp, we have dead language, language which contains no intelligible communication at all. Something which is used as a sham to disguise the fact that the intellectual cupboard is bare. In the second camp, we find misleading language, which fudges embarrassing or inconvenient truths. And in the third camp, we find doublespeak, language which is used as a stalking horse for quite different ideas that dare not speak their name. Now, the first camp is mainly the province of art critics and fools. The second and third are populated variously by representatives of big business, politicians and bureaucrats, and perhaps even the odd lawyer. I want to speak about each of them, but if time permits, I also want to give some examples of how language can be used really effectively, the way it ought to be used, the way we should all aspire to. Now, as in all things, when there are big issues at stake, there is always a few warriors to step up and line up for the defence. And I wanted to mention 4 of them. The first is Samuel Johnson. Now, Samuel Johnson in 1755 published his great Dictionary of the English Language. In the preface to the dictionary, which is a really good read, he despaired at the chaotic state of the language that he found. And he said, "It is the fate of those who toil at the lower employments of life to be rather driven by the fear of evil than attracted by the prospect of good, to be exposed to censure without hope of praise, to be disgraced by miscarriage or punished for neglect, where success would have been without applause and diligence without reward. Among these unhappy mortals is the writer of dictionaries." He also said, because he was a realist, "I'm not yet so lost in lexicography as to forget that words are the daughters of earth and that things are the sons of heaven. Language is only the instrument of science, and words are but signs of ideas. I wish, however, that the instrument might be less apt to decay, and that signs might be permanent, like the things which they denote." It's actually a pretty good and concise account of the real problem with language. What Johnson tried to do for orthography and etymology, H.W. Fowler tried to do for grammar. In 1926, Henry Watson Fowler published the most remarkable quirky book about grammar. I doubt that any quirkier book about grammar has ever been published in the English language. Modern English usage combines erudition and grumpiness in a way unrivalled since Johnson, and without the acerbity of Pope. He set out to expose error and ridicule folly. He understood how difficult the task was, and he, like Johnson, was a realist. Under the heading "Sturdy Indefensibles," he wrote, "Many idioms are seen, if they're tested by grammar or logic, to express badly, and sometimes to express the reverse of what they are nevertheless well understood to mean. Good people point out the sin, and bad people, who are more numerous, take little notice and go on committing it. Then the good people, if they're foolish, get excited and talk of ignorance and solecisms, and are laughed at as purists. Or if they are wise, they say no more about it and wait." And on split infinitives, he wrote, this is one of his most famous, "The English-speaking world may be divided into 1. Those who neither know nor care what a split infinitive is. 2. Those who do not know but care very much. 3, those who know and condemn. 4, those who know and approve. 5, those who know and distinguish. Those who neither know nor care are the vast majority and are a happy folk. Now, Johnson, as I've said, was also a realist. In the preface, he wrote, if the changes we fear, I mean, every generation throws up a large number of people who get anxious about the fact that the language is changing. And Johnson, of course, found a truly chaotic language, but he spoke of change in the preface by saying, if the changes we fear be thus irresistible, what remains but to acquiesce with silence, as in the other insurmountable distresses of humanity? It remains that we retard what we cannot repel, that we palliate what we cannot cure. Now, these grumpy old men of the English language concentrated on rules, grammar, orthography, spelling, usage, without really being concerned about the purpose for which language was being used. Love poems, business letters, history or journalism, for them it was all grist for the mill, or as we would say nowadays, input. 20 years after the first edition of Modern English Usage was published, George Orwell took the subject a step further. His message about the mistreatment of language and misuse of language was delivered as an essay, Politics and the English Language, very short essay actually, only about, I think about 5,000 or 10,000 words, and as a novel in 1984. He was less concerned with the details of grammar and usage and more concerned with the conscious misuse of language to conceal the speaker's true thoughts. He wrote, "A mass of Latin words falls upon the facts like soft snow, blurring the outline and covering up all the details. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish spurting ink." Now, Latin is no longer favoured or perhaps even understood by politicians or bureaucrats, but abstraction has taken its place. And this takes us into the heartland of dead language. The world is awash with examples of dead language, empty rhetoric dressed up in the current vogue, empty maundering of abstraction piled on abstraction. And if you get an abstract noun made into an artificial plural, of course, the effect is even better. These are the empty calories of modern discourse, the fast food of our language, the staple of cheap magazines, talkback radio, art criticism, most bureaucrats, and a lot of corporate communication. Now, in Death Sentence, Don Watson nails this brilliantly, and he highlights examples of it in various areas of activity. For example, from the English curriculum, I think in the Queensland Department of Education, the curriculum, they say, speaks of English as experimenting with ways of transforming experience into imaginative texts in different contexts for specified audiences, or monitoring and assessing the most appropriate technologies and processes for particular purposes of investigating, clarifying, organising and presenting ideas in personal, social, historical, cultural and workplace contexts. And I will take to lunch anyone who can accurately paraphrase what I've just said. Of this sort of violation, Don Watson says, "The language of corporations is like a vampire without fangs. It has no venom or bite, but you don't want it hanging off your neck for all that." And he explains, grammar is not the problem. To work on the grammar is like treating a man's dandruff when he has gangrene. The thing is systemically ill. It does not respond to any form of massage or manipulation. You try surgery, and when you finish, there's more on the floor than on the table. Look again, and you realise that it's been a corpse all along. It is composed entirely of dead matter. Now, it's not only bureaucrats and politicians who are capable of speaking in dead language. There's a wonderful judgment by Lord Justice Mackinnon in 1944. It's one of my favourite bits. He sounds like he would have been a good bloke. Mackinnon LJ was sitting in the Court of Appeal. He delivered the first of the 3 judgments in the case, and he began his judgment in a sense of despair of what the statute meant that he had to interpret. He began his judgment like this: "He must be a bold, if not a conceited, man who can feel confidence in forming or expressing an opinion on any one of the innumerable problems that arise out of the Rent and Mortgage Interest Restriction Acts. But having once more groped my way about that chaos of verbal darkness, I've come to the conclusion, with all becoming diffidence, that the County Court judge was wrong in this case. My diffidence is increased by finding that my brother Luxmore has groped his way to the opposite conclusion. Can I say, I live in a perpetual dread that somewhere, someone will write a similar criticism of something I've written. So, enough about dead language, a torrent of words and not a drop of meaning. Interesting also is the next kind of language misuse, though, the speech which disguises the thing that it's talking about. Depending on circumstances, it might be called tact or diplomacy or doublespeak or lying. The proper description depends on the speaker's purpose. Tact sets out to avoid giving offence. It suppresses or disguises an unhappy truth in order to spare the feelings of the other person. It's a down payment on future favour, or a falsehood in the service of kindness. When tact is lifted from the personal to the international level, it's called diplomacy. Now, euphemism doesn't directly suppress the truth, but disguises it by substituting gentler words for harsher ones. Its success is always limited in the long term because everyone understands what is the truth that is being disguised. It's like heavy makeup over an unsightly scar. Now, tact is kind, diplomacy useful. Euphemism is harmless enough and sometimes entertaining, but doublespeak is dangerous. In his closing address at the Nuremberg trial of the major German war criminals, the US prosecutor, Robert Jackson, who had completely messed up the cross-examination of Goering and had run the thing quite badly, made a fantastic final address. It is a really powerful piece of legal writing, and good that he did it, because otherwise I think the Nuremberg trials might have been forgotten altogether. An interesting thing, he was able to use language in such a deadening way for the most part of the trial that after 2 weeks the international press essentially lost interest and stopped turning up. Now, given the material he was working with, that's quite an achievement. I nearly said awesome, but there is a virus of a word that we have to stamp out. He said, this is in his final address, he said, "The fact is that the Nazi habit of economising in the use of truth pulls the foundations out from under their own defences. Lying has always been a highly approved Nazi technique. Nor is the lie direct the only means of falsehood. They all speak with a Nazi double talk with which to deceive the unwary. In the Nazi dictionary of sardonic euphemisms, final solution of the Jewish problem was a phrase which meant extermination. Special treatment of prisoners of war meant killing. Protective custody meant concentration camp. Duty labour meant slave labour. And in order to take a firm attitude or take positive measures meant to act with unrestrained savagery. Before we accept their word at what seems to be its face, we must always look for hidden meanings. Goering assured us on his oath that the Reich Defence Council never met as such. When we produced the stenographic minutes of a meeting at which he presided and did most of the talking, he reminded us of the as such and explained that this was not a meeting of the council as such because other people were present. It is against such a background that these defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this trial as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow as they beg of you, say I slew them not. And the Queen replied, then say they were not slain, but dead they are. If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, there are no slain, there has been no crime. Marvellous stuff. You rarely hear powerful rhetoric like that in courts these days, and hardly ever in Parliament, absolutely never in business. We learnt nothing from it, though. The war in Vietnam produced such chirpy doublespeak expressions as collateral damage, killing innocent civilians, removal with extreme prejudice, assassination, energetic disassembly, nuclear explosion. I love that one. Energetic disassembly, it's fantastic. Limited duration protective reaction airstrikes, which meant bombing villages in Vietnam. Incontinent ordnance, another good one, bombs which hit schools and hospitals by mistake. And active defence, which means invasion. When Soviet tanks invaded Prague in 1968, the manoeuvre was described by the Russians as fraternal internationalist assistance to the Czechoslovak people. Doublespeak uses language to smuggle uncomfortable ideas into comfortable minds. The Nazi regime were masters at it, and I have to say the Howard government were enthusiastic apprentices, ably assisted by the collaborators in the press. The victims of protective reaction airstrikes or incontinent ordnance or active defence or even fraternal internationalist assistance often flee for safety. A small number of them end up in Australia asking for help. They don't commit any offence under Australian or international law by coming here without an invitation, without papers, and simply asking for protection. Nonetheless, the Howard government and the media referred to them constantly as illegals, which carries the clear implication that they have committed some kind of offence. This doublespeak was not accidental, and neither was it transient, because the Coalition's latest refugee policy statement, issued just a week or two ago, refers to illegals 26 times. And on the Insight programme, Tuesday this week, Philip Ruddock defended that usage. Of course, the point of it is clear. If you call a group of people illegals who are doing nothing worse than escaping from the Taliban, whom we are fighting in Afghanistan, or fleeing Saddam Hussein whilst we try to bomb him out of the place, well then it makes it more respectable to lock them up. Because what do you do to illegal people? You lock them up. And that's the way doublespeak works. Now, it takes a degree of skill, or in some cases simple laziness, to speak in lies or half-truths without being caught at it. But equally it takes great skill to speak with language that conveys the truth and makes it glow. Just as the use of cliches and abstractions can strip the life out of language, so concrete words and fresh metaphors can make it radiant. It may seem like an absurd idiosyncrasy to talk about the need to use concrete words rather than abstract words. It sounds a bit like strunk and white. But it's important because we tend to remember images much more than we remember words. And certainly abstract words are much harder to remember than the images conjured by concrete words. Language which conjures up a vivid image is likely to leave a mark in the hearer's mind in a way that a sentence of abstractions simply won't. There's a nice example of this also coming from the Nuremberg trials, because in late 45, early 46, Rebecca West went to Nuremberg in order to watch the opening of the trials. And she wrote an essay about it called Greenhouse with Cyclamens. And it's very interesting because she was not interested in the historical importance of the occasion, great though that was. She wasn't really interested in the legal underpinnings of it, novel though they were. She was interested in the feeling of the occasion, in the sense of time and place. And many of you will remember the famous photograph taken of the defendants in the dock at the opening of the first of the trials, with the 24 defendants in the dock, with Goering in pole position and Hess beside him and so on down the line, and at each end a pale helmeted UN guard. It's a very famous photograph. She decided to describe in words various of the defendants as they sat in the dock on that famous day. And her description of them is as powerful as any photograph you could ever imagine. She said of Rudolf Hess, Hess had the classless air characteristic of asylum inmates. Evidently, his distracted personality had torn up all clues to his past. He looked as if his mind had no surface, as if every part of it had been blasted away except for the depths where nightmares dwell. And she said of Julius Streicher, who was the editor of Die Stürmer newspaper in Munich, anti-Semitic, dreadful anti-Semitic newspaper, she said of him, he looked like the sort of gentleman who gives trouble in parks, which I cannot think of a more withering backhander. And to do it in one sentence is devastating. But then she said of Goering, Goering's appearance made a strong but obscure allusion to sex. He looked as one who would never lift a hand against a woman save in something much more peculiar than kindness. He did not look like any recognised type of homosexual, yet he was feminine. Sometimes, particularly when his humour was good, he recalled the madam of a brothel. Her like to be seen in the late morning in doorways along the steep streets of Marseille, the professional mask of geniality still hard on their faces, though they stand relaxed in leisure, their fat cats rubbing against their spread skirts. I can never think of Goering without that image coming to mind. Now, in the early 1930s, an Irish writer called Patrick Leigh Fermor, who some of you may have heard of, decided to go for a walk. And being young, enthusiastic and Irish, he decided to walk from the Hook of Holland to Constantinople. That's quite a walk. He kept a diary. The diary was lost, and it was later found again and was published under the title A Time of Gifts in the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. I do wonder whether it's the original diary, because the writing is rather too advanced, I think, for his age at the time. However that may be, he has a dazzling way with metaphor. Sometimes he trails it on a bit, but he gets away with it. He said this when he's in a cafe somewhere in the Czech heartland. As I listened to the muffled vowels of the Slovaks and the traffic jams of consonants and the explosive spurts of dentals and sibilants, my mind's eye automatically suspended an imaginary backcloth of the Slav heartlands behind the speakers. 3 reeds on a horizontal line, the mapmaker's symbol for a swamp, infinitely multiplied. Spruce and poplar forests, stilt houses and fish traps, frozen plains and lakes where the ice holes were black with waterfowl. Then at the astonishing sound of Magyar, a dactylic canter, where the ictus of every initial syllable set off a troop of identical vowels with their accents all swerving one way, like wheat ears in the wind. So, how do people come up with that? It's fantastic. Our language like this speaks with force and clarity, which is unmistakable, unforgettable, and quite dazzling. The message remains long after the words have faded from memory. The tragedy is that now most public utterances are the polar opposite of this. They're bleached of all meaning, they stifle the capacity for thought, and they sap the will to live. It's a rare event. It's a rare event these days to hear a politician make a speech which is better than tedious. If any Australian Prime Minister were to make a speech which is interesting, we are fascinated. If they made a speech which bordered on the inspirational, we would ring the lutein bell and declare a public holiday. And if a leading business person made a speech which sounded inspirational, we'd want to vote her Prime Minister. Keating, of course, did make a few good speeches, in particular the formal ones which were written by Don Watson. And he knows a thing or two about writing. He did, by the way, make a fantastic observation about another Labor Prime Minister, Bob Hawke. In Death Sentence, he says of Bob Hawke, when Hawke embarked on a sentence impromptu, it was like watching a blind man in a dark room with a club. He would crash his way about wildly until onlookers lost interest in what he was trying to say and became more concerned with his prospects of escape. And when eventually he managed to finish a sentence, we would applaud. Not for the gift of enlightenment, but as one applauds a man who walks away from an avalanche or a train wreck. And I'm sure there are some of you who can remember exactly that phenomenon. But he wrote some fantastic speeches for Keating, including, of course, the famous Redfern speech. The informal remarks of Keating that we remember the best are the frank exchanges in Parliament, when he couldn't be bothered hedging his bets. When he said, "I want to do you slowly," he probably offended John Hewson and a few other people besides, but you couldn't mistake his meaning. Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generations on the 13th of February 2008 sounded marvellous, not because it was great rhetoric, which it wasn't, but because it was so direct and so honest. By contrast, Brendan Nelson's reply speech, which started quite well, was a mess because he tried to work both sides of the street and ended up with a message that was so diffuse and contradictory that it sounded like indecision at best or hypocrisy at worst. That's why, I think, we get very few good speeches from politicians and business people, because it is the business and of politics to keep options open, to appeal to the broadest possible spectrum of opinion, to please some without alienating anyone else. So meanings are blurred and the truth is covered over with an ambiguous fig leaf, and language suffers because we've become inured to the idea that language is just a mouthful of words, and arousing passion with speech is the province of playwrights or statesmen from a bygone age. Now, it's interesting, every now and then I go back over the essays in Word Watching. I wrote them over a series of years, writing them one each quarter for publication in the Victorian Bar News, because they have very low editorial standards. And they were put together as a collection a couple of years ago. And because of the circumstance in which I wrote them, of course, they span quite a long time. And I'm interested to look back over them and see, I can't really tell how long ago I wrote any of them, because my attitude to change in language and what some people would characterise as the deterioration in language has not changed. I don't mind. I really don't mind if people get words wrong or misuse language, so long as we can understand clearly what they mean. And I don't mind if people seek to boldly split infinitives that have never been split before. In fact, it excites me. But I do resent reading or hearing anything which leaves me wondering whether the author had any coherent idea to express at all. And when we spot someone debasing the glories of our language by using it to anaesthetise or deceive, we should reach for a revolver. Thank you.